Professor Audrey, how have these times been for you? These Corona times, have they been difficult? How have you been managing?
Oh, thank you. Thank you for asking. I'm fine. I'm healthy. My family is healthy so far. We hope that continues. We started classes yesterday at Rutgers University in New Jersey, where I teach. We're fully online. That's taking quite a bit of time and effort. So, we're all just sort of trying to be as careful as possible, and hoping that there's not a second wave, and if it is, that we can sort of ride it out here in the U.S. So
let's definitely hope so. Yeah, all prayers for your family, for everybody, and I hope you're able to maneuver through these times really safely. Okay, so I think it's time for us to begin our session. It's titled Aurangzeb, the Man and the Myth, with Professor Audrey Truschke herself. Allow me to introduce the panel first. So, Audrey Truschke is a historian, author, and activist. She is an associate professor of South Asian history at Rutgers University in New Jersey. She is the author of two award-winning books, Culture of Encounters, Sanskrit at the Mughal Court, and Aurangzeb, Man and the Myth. She's also known for her activism against abuses of human rights and history, especially in South Asia and especially on Twitter. So, yeah, that's that. And she's also known for, um, today we're going to talk to her about a really popular book, Aurangzeb, the Man and the Myth. I'm Aamir Khan. I'm a PhD scholar in history, and I will be your host for the evening. Let me also thank Tawari Khwani for organizing this really wonderful session. So I'm going to begin with the session. The subject of the book is quite evident and quite popular. Aurangzeb was the sixth Mughal king and ruled over most of India in the latter part of the 17th century. He's a man who has been both popular and notorious with different sections of our society. Nevertheless, Aurangzeb is a man who has always been the subject of much attention. My first question to you, Professor, would be a cliche. What prompted you to take up Aurangzeb as the premise of your book?
what made me decide to sort of dive into the fire, right, with Aurangzeb Alamgir? So I did it for a couple of different reasons. The sort of okay, let me just give them in no particular order. I think the intellectual reason to do this is that I realized that there was a significant gulf of understanding between sort of scholarly opinions and views on Aurangzeb Alamgir, which have progressed significantly over the last couple of decades, versus popular perceptions of him, which have not progressed at all. If anything, they've regressed over the past few decades. And so I thought, why not try to bridge that gap? Or why not try to sort of bring scholarly knowledge and advancement to a more widespread audience? On a sort of more personal level, I also realized that, after finishing my first book, Culture of Encounters, I realized that I knew a lot about Aurangzeb Alamgir. I thought a lot about him, and yet I'd written almost nothing about him. There's about 5 pages on him in my first book, and it's basically explaining why I'm not going to talk about him, why I stop with his ascension to the throne. And so I sort of, I'd sort of done a certain amount of the work already, and so it seemed reasonable to sort of go on to that for the next project. The last reason that I'll give is a more political one, right? Which is that people were really interested in Aurangzeb, right? Aurangzeb Road gets renamed. Everyone's screaming at each other. Political parties in India are accusing each other of being worse than Aurangzeb and bringing back Aurangzeb Raj and all this stuff. And on the one hand, historians usually love it when people are interested in the past and talking about it. But of course, looking at how Aurangzeb was being sort of used as this political football and being deployed as this stand-in for all Indian Muslims to signal the acceptability of hating on that minority group, I mean, that was horrifying. And so I sort of wondered if I might step into that and make a kind of classic historian's intervention, which is to share actual historical information, not about Aurangzeb the myth, but to cut through that to get back to Aurangzeb the king. So those are some of the reasons, a bit of the background, why I decided to write the book when I did and sort of how I did.
Yeah, that kind of reminds me of this sentence that I saw over and over in this book. So one of the things that I feel from the plinth of your work is the criterion that you mentioned yourself, understanding history and historical figures on their own terms. So can you throw some light on this?
Mm. So this is something that is the subject of, I think, mass misunderstanding in general, probably in life, but obviously I've seen it a lot through the lens of my Aurangzeb book. So all historians essentially want to understand historical figures on their own terms, right? That's sort of like, historical method 101 is you don't judge the past by the terms of the present. You don't want to impose anachronistic ideas, right? Meaning you don't want to take modern ideas and use them to sort of misunderstand the past, right? You want to understand who historical figures were, why they acted as they did. You want to understand their reasoning, right? Their motivations, rather than judging them, because our judgment tends to come in the way of our analytical possibilities. You also want to empathize with historical figures, right? You really want to see, why did they do it, right? Rather than making them out to be villains. Now, for many historians, I think this is sort of so drilled into us. It's goes so deep in the discipline that people sometimes forget that, when you step outside the bubble of historians and you start speaking to ordinary people, right? Like everyone who's not a historian, people tend to mishear that, right? I say empathy and they hear excuse, right? Or justify. And that's not what I mean at all. Right? No one's trying to justify Aurangzeb Alangir. No one's trying to say he was a good guy, right? I mean, maybe someone's trying to say that, but not me, for sure. All right? No one's trying to do that at all, right? We're trying to withhold value judgment in pursuit of historical understanding, right? And I do want to underscore that it's not withholding value judgment just for itself, right? It's not that we just, never want to judge the past, because why would we do that? It's because judging figures in the past like Aurangzeb Alangir prevent us from historically understanding them, right? That's the real problem with doing that, or at least one real problem. So what I want to do is to some degree, at least for a while, I want to sort of, try to get people to forget about the 21st century controversies, right? And instead go back, right? Try to imagine what life was like in the second half of the 17th century in India, why Aurangzeb acted the way he did, what his sort of ideals and visions and motivations and compromises were, and then how that shaped people's lived experiences, both his lived experience and various other peoples in his empire, and ultimately how it changed the course of Indian and South Asian history.
Definitely. I really agree with that idea. And I think the idea of the present, the vision of the present, blurs the vision of the past. Because you're so occupied right now, you can't see it past that. I totally agree with that. Very valuable points. So, yeah, neat principle. Moving on, let's look at Aurangzeb for a while. Paraphrasing from your book. Aurangzeb was born in 1618 AD as the third son of Prince Khurram, who was later to become Shah Jahan. He wasn't exactly the apple of his father's eye. After his basic education, he was sent away on different missions around parts of India at the young age of 16. Since then, he rarely, if ever, saw his father. Dara Shikoh, on the other hand, who was the eldest son, spent all his time at court being primed to be the next king. So my question to you would be, do you think Shah Jahan expected his other sons to just bow out? Do you think the Battle of Samud, which was a battle between Aurangzeb and Dara Shikoh, do you think it was inevitable?
That's a good question. So I suppose, I can't get inside Shah Jahan's head. I don't really know what he was thinking. It seems, based on his actions, it would seem that Shah Jahan harbored hope that he could influence the next succession, right? He seemed to think that by privileging Dara, right, Dara Shikoh, that, Dara was always supposed to be one step ahead of his brothers, right? He always had a higher Mansab rank. He always had a little bit more money. His dad actually liked being around him as opposed to with Aurangzeb. So Shah Jahan seemed to think that he could have some say here. I'm not sure why Shah Jahan thought that, however, right? That's pretty inconsistent with prior Mughal practices, including Shah Jahan's own experience. And then perhaps, maybe that was playing out with him, sort of pushing back against, sort of what he did and his brothers did to their father. I don't know. But in the end, it didn't work. And it really, looking back, it could never have worked. Right. And there's a sort of larger historical point perhaps there that, when you're in the middle of history, when you're actually living through a moment, sometimes you just can't see the larger historical forces that are shaping what's happening around you. But we can see it now, hundreds of years later, right? And it seems that, Shah Jahan, he was not going to make Dara king, at least not the way he did. Right. And perhaps important here is to mention that by keeping Dara close to him at court, Shah Jahan actually put him at a disadvantage in the end. Right. Dara could not run a battlefield to save his life, literally. Right. I mean, that's what happens is he can't control troops. He just doesn't have it in him. Well, let me rephrase that. It's not that he doesn't have it in him. Maybe he did have it in him, and he was just never given the opportunity and the training, whereas Aurangzeb was. Right, he had 2.5 decades to practice and hone his skills as a leader in battle, as an administrator, and he was much more well positioned at the end of the day than Dara to win. As to whether battles were inevitable, I think that the War of Succession was inevitable. But everything else, all the details, exactly how it happened, when it happened, and who won, none of that was preordained. Right? I think it could have gone differently, but historians don't tend to go in for the what ifs of history very often. We tend to stick to analyzing what we know actually occurred.
Right. That's a really great answer. And I think, like you mentioned, Shah Jahan, by keeping Dara Shikoh close to himself, actually wrote what was about to come.
Mm-hmm.
That is a kind of predestination.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I'll move on. Next question that I have, I'll just give a little background to it. While Aurangzeb's treatment, Acha, I have already done this. So yeah, now the reign of Aurangzeb, starting tumultuously with finding smoothing pace really quickly. His initial days were full of pomp and music, but after the first decade, most of that ceased. The Jharoka Darshans, the patronage to music, etc., all of it. Why do you think this happened?
So I have some thoughts, but I don't have the full answer on this. Okay, so sort of historically, I mean, as you say, Aurangzeb comes to the throne 1658 to 59, right? Sort of depending on when exactly, which coronation you want to date it from. And for the first roughly decade, he rules as a sort of standard Mughal king, right? Not that much changes, that musicians are at court, artists, he has a court historian, all this sort of stuff. And then about a decade in, he institutes some major changes. He reassigns his court musicians, right? Sometimes people say he fired them. He actually didn't fire them. He gave them raises, but he made them do other stuff. So no more music at court. He fired his court historian, which, while everybody else in 2020 is angry at Aurangzeb for other reasons, that's what I'm angry about. The man fired his court. Maybe I'll get over that someday, but I'm not over that yet. So I'm very upset about that. And he changes other aspects of court protocol. Right, Aurangzeb was very interested in sort of proper court protocol, but not necessarily some of the sort of dressing on things. So he sort of changes things in that regard. And so why? So in a sense, I think it's actually a standard move that other Mughal kings did, just in different ways, which is that he put his own stamp on Mughal kingship. Right, he'd been king for a decade. He just wanted to change things in certain ways. He also, I would point out, did have a lot of continuity, right? Which is not to say that we don't need to explain the changes. We do, but we also need to account for the continuity, right? He continued holding court once to twice a day. He did continue with most court protocols, so on and so forth. He continued with patronage projects. Okay, it didn't tend to be art or music, but it coming from him specifically. But the Fatawai Alamgiri comes about, right? This huge law book, right? And that's very much it being a large scale written text patronized by a Mughal king. That's very much in the Mughal model. So he wanted to make Mughal kingship his own thing, but not entirely, right? It was sort of a mixed bag. I think a slightly more complicated question is actually to what extent people on the ground perceived all of this as a major change, right? And there are signs, at least small signs, that people really didn't perceive this as some big issue, right? So one thing that I mentioned in the book is that, as late as the early 18th century, right, when Aurangzeb is old and dying and wandering around in the Deccan, you have people still writing Persian Ramayanas and dedicating it to him. You still have Hindu astrologers that have direct access to him. So there's these indications that many of these older models that, if you think of Aurangzeb the myth, just don't fit in at all. Actually, in reality, for Aurangzeb the king and the man, we're still around.
Right, right. So, one of the things that I have seen that this patronage to, or the lack of it, to music and things that we think are more worldly, and then patronage to that, like from what I used to hear when I was young, that he used to write the Quran himself, and he used to earn money out of that. He was a kind of poor king. He was very, I wouldn't say, like, for lack of a better word, he was stingy. He was thrifty, I would say, and he was very Islamic and he was very Muslim. That is what people nowadays use. I would want to go into that later. But do you think there's this lack of music, this patronage to the Fatawa Alamgiri, which is essentially a Hanafi law book, which is again, Muslim? So do you think this thing that he was really Islamic? Do you think that is a thing? That's right.
So the answer is yes and no, right? I mean, the first thing we have to examine what we mean by Islamic, right? There's a lot of assumptions there about what it means to be a good Muslim. Okay, there's also a lot of cherry picking. There tends to be, right? So people mention the Hanafi law code stuff. The Quran. Aurangzeb was a Hafiz. He did memorize the Quran, but people forget that he was also a Sufi, right? I mean, the man is literally buried at a Chishti shrine still. That was his wish, right? Like, not just Sufi, but like the most Indian of Sufis, right? Chishtis. He was talismanic. He did all sorts of stuff that would make, like, the sort of Saudi Wahhabi group go absolutely insane today. Was he a real Muslim? Was he the most Muslim of the Mughal kings? Well, it really depends on how you define Muslim, right? I have no idea if he was personally pious, right? Just like I can't get inside Shah Jahan's mind, I can't get inside Aurangzeb's either. I can tell you this, though. He performed his piety on a public stage. He was fully aware of the power of religion to motivate people and to sway people, and political uses for his Islam. And that doesn't mean he wasn't also a true believer. Maybe he was, maybe he wasn't, right? But I can't get at the trueness of his belief. What I can get at are his political uses of Islam, right? And that he very much did do. Let me say a couple of other things on this. So this comes up a lot. This whole, he sewed prayer caps and used this pocket money to live. So I really don't know how Aurangzeb has such bad PR on everything else, like temple destruction and stuff, but such good PR on this particular point. Aurangzeb Alamgir was the richest man alive in his day, right? He was the wealthiest dude living and walking on the face of the earth. How he got this reputation as some impoverished guy, I'm not entirely clear on that. All right, but it's not true. Like, maybe he sewed prayer caps, maybe he didn't. The historical record's a little light on that. I do mention it in the book, however. But he had a huge treasury, and throughout his life, he was engaged in large-scale campaigns that cost a lot of money, right? One other thing I'll say about Aurangzeb's piety. So most people have sort of cast this as Aurangzeb's piety influenced his politics, right? So he was so Muslim that he brought back the jizya tax, or he hated on Hindus, or whatever specific thing we're discussing. If anything, I think that the influence went the other way. I think that Aurangzeb's experiences as a king and as a political figure actually influenced his piety, right? And I'll give just one example of that. So when the War of Succession happens, it starts in 1657, Shah Jahan falls ill, right? He looks like he was going to die. That's why his 4 sons mobilized to fight for the throne. But Shah Jahan recovered and lived highly inconveniently for the 4 sons. So by the time the dust of conflict settled, a little less than 2 years later, Aurangzeb had not only beat his 3 brothers, which was fine, like that was not a sort of Islamic problem for anyone, but he had overthrown his father, which was a big problem because it went against Sharia, right? Islamic law as understood by Aurangzeb and by everyone else around him, right? And so Aurangzeb had a problem, right? He is suddenly an illegitimate king according to Sharia. And other Islamic rulers across the world taunted him for this, right? You know, the Safavid kings. Yeah, he sends him this letter. The Sharifs of Mecca refuse Aurangzeb's financial gifts because they say he's an illegitimate ruler while his dad is still living. And this goes on for 7.5 years until Shah Jahan, kicks the bucket and the situation resolves itself that way. And I think that, we see signs of Aurangzeb's increased, at least public piety in those first 10 years. Specifically, that's when he memorized Quran, right? Was in his first 10 years on the throne. And I wonder if those two might be connected, right? If that he could never be a good Muslim king because he needed to be a king, right? And Aurangzeb was a king first and foremost. When his piety and his thirst for power conflicted, he chose power every single time, right? That was not a close call for him. But that doesn't mean that might not then, of course, have influenced his piety and how he practiced as a Muslim.
So you think it was a requirement because he was deemed illegitimate by the Safavid king and the Sharifs of Makkah, so he had to put this act up that he's still legitimate in the eyes of the public or his own people.
Yeah, I guess I feel like I can't say exactly why, was he trying to compensate? Was he actually personally affected by this and sort of searched in his own religion? I'm not sure, right? I don't have the evidence on which to make that, that sort of, claim in specificity, but I feel like if you add up all the evidence, there's something there to that.
Definitely possible. Right. It's always nice talking to a historian. So evidence-based, so scientific, and
no, absolutely. And I probably don't need to remind this audience of this, but like anyone who you talk to who claims to like be a historian and always has the answers is like not a historian, right? Like historians work in like degrees of certainty, and like there's a lot of like we don't know going on, right? That's one mark of someone who's being honest.
Definitely. It reminds me of Socrates. The only thing I know is that I know nothing. Also, so yeah, why this thing that you mentioned, the temple raising and the Sharia enforcing, why all of that? People usually remember Aurangzeb in India today as someone who raised a lot of temples and he tried to impose Sharia. I don't want to get into the why of why people think that. I want to know, did that really happen? Because they say if there's some fire, there has to be some smoke there. So there had to be some on some degree, some level of temple raising. But why did that happen? Or did that happen with all Mughal kings and Aurangzeb was chosen? And that part of his reign was highlighted because he had the longest reign of all Mughal kings.
So in short, yes, Aurangzeb Alamgir destroyed and desecrated some Hindu temples and Jain temples. Right? People always mention the Hindu stuff and forget the Jain stuff, but he didn't destroy or desecrate nearly as many temples as most people think he did. Okay, there are about a dozen confirmed temple destructions over his 50-year, more or less, reign, tied directly to, sort of under him. Slightly more than a dozen, I think it's slightly less than a dozen, tied to his direct command. Okay, so sometimes people think of Aurangzeb Alamgir as like he couldn't pass a temple without destroying it, right? That's hardly the case. So when historians set out to understand why did he destroy certain temples, alongside that we have to explain why he didn't destroy most temples, right? Because he could have, right? He was king. He could have destroyed far more Hindu temples than he did. And so for Aurangzeb, the sort of temple destruction and temple preservation, his actions in both of those regards really do go together. I think I should say, Aurangzeb did not come up with this idea of destroying Hindu and Jain temples, or in some cases, desecrating rather than fully destroying them. Muslim kings had done this for hundreds of years in India before, and Muslim kings didn't invent this either. Hindu kings did, right? I mean, you go back to like the Cholas were doing this, okay? So, Muslim kings show up in India in the late 12th century. They have no problem sort of getting on this bandwagon, but they didn't create the initial momentum. Key to understanding the temple destructions for Aurangzeb and for anyone else in Indian history is this. Hindu temples, especially, were considered to be sites of political authority. That is something that is hard, I think, for us to imagine today, in part because it's just really offensive, according to modern ideas, right? In modernity, religion is at least supposed to be sacrosanct, right? To destroy a temple or something, right? To invade a sacred space of religious activity. If a state does that, there's like nothing worse, right? That's horrible. I don't contest that as a modern value. I like that as a modern value, as a matter of fact. But that's not how pre-modernity works, right? Pre-modernity doesn't care, obviously, about our hangups and ideals today. So in pre-modern times, Hindu temples, they were religious sites. They were also sites of political authority. And so when someone gave you political problems, you could hit their temple, right? And that was a way of hitting them back. It was considered a legitimate target. And that is what essentially explains why Aurangzeb targeted some Hindu temples, specific ones, while leaving the vast majority untouched, is that people associated with those specific temples did something to upset him, right? They went against Mughal state interests in some regard.
Right.
And again,
yeah, please go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, and again, when I say some of this, sometimes people hear justification. There is no justification here. I'm not saying it was good. I'm not saying it was right. I'm telling you why it happened, right? Because there is so much more to know and think about the past than how you feel about it in the present.
Definitely. If you just keep looking at the past through religious lenses, that's not going to work. And it reminds me of the Crusades when. Not the the Crusades and the campaign done by Mehmed, then the cathedral, the Hagia Sophia, it was taken over. That was a religious monument. And when around the same time when the Spanish king, he did the Reconquista, so the Alhambra was converted into a cathedral. So it happens all over the pre-modern world. So it isn't something to be shocked at. Do you think you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, I would urge specificity in historical comparisons. But in general, I sometimes remind people that, if you want to think about whether you're going to be like shocked or offended by something that some prior person did, if they're a pre-modern king, like that's all you need to know. You're going to be shocked and offended, right? You really don't need to go much further. The pre-modern world was very different.
Definitely. They didn't even understand things like secularism and stuff, or the separation of church and state.
Well, those things didn't exist.
They didn't exist. Exactly.
These are modern constructs, right? And again, I mean, we can embrace them and love them as part of the modern world. We just have to recognize that when we're trying to understand pre-modernity, they get in the way.
Nice talking to you. I'm really enjoying this conversation.
Absolutely.
Right. So, okay, so I'll move on. Aurangzeb spent the second half of his reign in the south pursuing an aggressive expansionist policy. Here he met warriors like Shivaji and kingdoms like Golconda. Why not stay north and enjoy? Why bother to enshroud all parts of India? Why do you think that happened?
So this is a question that there is sort of a really easy answer to, and then sort of a kind of like we throw up our hands and really don't know answer. So the easy answer is that the Mughals were an expansionist dynasty, right? And so trying to gain more land was sort of a core activity that Mughal rulers did and wanted to do. The only major difference with Aurangzeb, as opposed to especially the two prior Mughal kings before him, is that he succeeded, right? He succeeded in conquering the Deccan where others had failed. Even Akbar, even his great-grandfather, couldn't, he thirsted for the Deccan, but he couldn't get it. So in a sense, Aurangzeb needed no further justification to expand his empire, right? That's in to a great degree, that is what the Mughal Empire was.
Already
It was
amazing.
an expansionist dynasty.
Mhm.
But the part where we throw up our hands is, he's down there for what, about 20 some years, right? More than a quarter of a century. And he sort of loses his way, right? Early on, he takes Bijapur, he takes Golconda. There are these sort of big, clear, victories and conquests. He's expanding Mughal power. But then he just starts wandering around, going from hill fort to hill fort. One siege goes on for over 7 years. You cannot have an effective siege go on for 7 years. Like, everyone should die within like 2 years, if not well before. So like it wasn't a real siege, right? Stuff was getting through the lines. He appears to be unable to control his generals. He'll take a fort, spend years taking it, and then walk away, and it's like retaken by the Marathas or by someone else within months. And you sort of wonder, why didn't he go home to northern India, right? He's facing increasing pressure in the north, from various groups. I'm sorry?
He never got back.
He never went back? No, he died in South India, right? And he's buried there. He still hasn't gone back, right? We know a couple of things. We know that Aurangzeb liked it in the south. Okay, he writes about this in his letters specifically. He actually enjoys South India, which is very different. Many of his troops were real North Indians. And today, some people think of India as some sort of unified place. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't, but people didn't think about it that way even in pre-modernity, right? Like, North Indians write during Aurangzeb's period about South India as a foreign place, very much. So many of his troops are dissatisfied. Like, they hate the weather, the fruit, the people look different. I mean, they have like a litany of complaints. Whereas Aurangzeb seemed to like it. He's pretty old. I mean, he's in his late 80s by the time he dies, which, I probably don't need to remind people, but most people lived far shorter lives back then than now. So he's like real old by the standards of the day. I think there's serious questions about his capacity towards the end and to what degree he's actually running and controlling things. But none of that really answers the core, at least a core question for me, which is, how does a man whose ascent to power was defined and achieved through his military acumen, how does he completely lose that in the final years, arguably even decades of his life? And I really don't know. I don't have a clear answer to that. I'm clear that it happened, but I'm not exactly sure why.
Maybe he's got too old.
Yeah, maybe he got too old, but I mean, he's writing letters. He's not like, completely out of it, like in the loony house or something. So I don't know. I think in the end, there's not a single answer. There's probably a medley of things.
Tussle with Shivaji. It's quite a tussle that's happening right now as well. So what would your comment be on that? The Maratha.
Shivaji. Shivaji. So yeah, I mean, Shivaji was like a major pain for Aurangzeb, because he won't submit to Mughal authority, right? Aurangzeb sort of almost gets him as a prince, and then he has to go deal with the War of Succession, and he finally sort of gets him in 1665 to 66. He drags Shivaji up to the Mughal court in northern India, and Shivaji makes a complete fool of himself at court. Aurangzeb is horrified. The Rajputs are horrified. Like everybody else, everyone in the Mughal Empire is horrified. And then Shivaji escapes. He escapes from house arrest, and he remains a thorn in Aurangzeb's side for the rest of Shivaji's life, right, until he dies in 1680. And it's I see why it enlivens people's imaginations today. It's a real mismatch in a sense, right? I mean, Shivaji is this he starts out, he's a small-time nobody. He's like this guerrilla warfare guy. And he bests the largest, most powerful army in the world again and again and again, right? People love to root for the underdog. Today, of course, Shivaji is recast as some sort of Hindu warrior opposing Muslim rule. And that is insane. I mean, historically, that is nonsense. It's nonsensical because Hindu and Muslim as the categories we think of today didn't exist back then. Right? Especially Hindu. Okay. Also, both sides have people of the other religion. Right. I mean, there's actually one battle where the guy leading Shivaji's army happens to be Muslim and the guy leading Aurangzeb's army happens to be Hindu. So, if any, for people today who think that this was some attempt to establish the Hindu Rashtra 300 years too early, if they were transported back to that battle, they'd get the sides wrong, I think. Just looking at who the people are in religious terms. At the end of the day, our modern interests really don't serve us well for understanding the Shivaji Aurangzeb conflict. Shivaji wanted power. He saw no reason to submit to Mughal rule. He thought that he could get away with carving out his own little fiefdom, and he was right. He accomplished that.
Yeah,
right.
He did.
It didn't go so well for his successors. Right.
The immediate successors.
Yes. So Shivaji, of course, gets captured by Aurangzeb, and then Aurangzeb tortures him to some degree. We have conflicting accounts of exactly how much torture, but I mean, this was a world of cruel political violence on all sides. That was just standard par for the course. And of course, and then Shivaji is executed, and that could not have gone any other way, right? After what Shivaji did in Aurangzeb's court, there was no going back from that for the Marathas.
Well, why do you think Shivaji did, or representing the Marathas, didn't do what the Rajputs did? Or looking from the Mughal perspective, why weren't the Mughals able to tame the Marathas? Or, for lack of a better word, obviously, why weren't they able to have better diplomatic relations with the Marathas as they did with the Rajputs?
So there's a couple of answers to that. One is that the Marathas were very different. And again, if you think through the category of Hindus today, you see Marathas and Rajputs as, like brothers. And that's not how people perceived it at the time, right? I mean, the Rajputs, they were Kshatriyas, they had the proper, caste and class. They had all of these customs that were in many ways, in terms of political customs, very close to Mughal customs, right? That's arguably one culture, more or less, by this point in time. That's not, the Marathas, Shivaji's caste, it's a matter of his, political uncomfortability today, but historically, there's no doubt. The man's born a Shudra and tries to become a Kshatriya through an invented ceremony. So basically, the Marathas are outsiders, right? They're wannabe Rajputs. And they're trying to enter this group. And the Rajputs, like many people who defend the sort of, boundaries of their world, they really don't want the Marathas there. They think of them as uncouth and low class and are horrified by them. So that's one thing, is that the Marathas are sort of a very different sort of people. Another answer is that eventually the Mughals really do integrate the Marathas. They really do tame most of them, right? In the latter decades of Aurangzeb's rule, many Marathas are integrated into the Mughal state and Mughal state service. That's one big reason why the percentage of Hindus serving in the upper echelons of the Mughal nobility goes up under Aurangzeb, is the incorporation of Marathas, right, who have been conquered. The story is perhaps remembered different because the Mughal Empire starts to fracture pretty soon after Aurangzeb Alamgir's death. So you don't have the sort of same period of ongoing integration that we do with most Rajput lineages. But again, when the Marathas start to be integrated into the Mughal nobility, the biggest objectors are the Rajputs, right? They're the ones that are most uncomfortable with that development.
So, I absolutely agree with that. I think that must have been the reason. So, despite so many achievements, on the other hand, Aurangzeb on his deathbed, guilt-ridden soul, many people extrapolate that to either his treatment of his family or to mean that he had been harsh with his subjects. What is your opinion on this?
So, I think you're referring to these deathbed letters, right? Where he says things like, I'm going to go to hell and I've messed it all up and, God hates me, various things, like this. And I think partly he says them because you're supposed to say them, right? That's what you're supposed to do when you're quoting Persian poetry on your deathbed, and you're in a Persianate world like he was.
Deathbed poetry.
Absolutely, that was sort of part of what it was, right? To be a cultured king and individual. I think some historians, I would say, would stop there. They would just say, look, you're supposed to say that. That's it. I think that oftentimes people use sort of conventions to also communicate truth, right? I don't see a conflict between those two, right? You can always ask, why this convention? Why don't you use another convention, right? There's always more than one usually to choose from. And so I think that there possibly is truth in that. I wonder if Aurangzeb had some sense that staying in the Deccan in southern India was like a mistake. Like maybe he should have gone back to Delhi for a while or something. One thing I think is very clear is that he did worry about the future of the Mughal Empire. He was concerned about both his sons and his grandsons, right? So because he lived for so long, some of his sons actually predeceased him and things like that. So, a grandson could well have taken over. And he's worried about whether they'll rule as well as he has, in his opinion. And I think, so in a sort of dark irony, his concern with this over multiple decades leads him to sort of shackle the Mughal princes and deny them the freedoms that he had had to cultivate being a good administrator and being good on the battlefield and having one's own household and all of this. And that probably plays at least some role in the sort of downfall of the Mughal Empire in the, roughly 30 years after his death.
Is that like the apple didn't fall far from the tree? He did the same thing, committed the same mistakes that Shah Jahan did?
That's interesting. No, I think it's actually a different set of mistakes, right? Shah Jahan didn't like Aurangzeb, as far as we can tell, but he let him run free, right? He had him serve the empire, so on and so forth. Maybe Aurangzeb worried that someone would lock him up for 7.5 years, right, and throw away the key. I mean, I think that was definitely a concern that prior Mughal kings had with good reason. So,
nice. Last of all, why is Aurangzeb relevant at all? Why probably don't talk about Humayun or Jahangir as much? We don't. And why does he evoke such passions in today's world? Also, do you think you've been critical enough with him?
So the long answer there has to do with British colonial history, right? So in short, the British show up in India. There's a group of white dudes from some, cold, godforsaken island, right? And they want to rule over as much of India as possible. And that's kind of a hard sell. Like, why would a bunch of white dudes from like really far away that no one's ever been to, like rule over this like massive area of land that has never been politically unified before? And so one way that the British justify this is by saying, look, we're better than your prior kings. And when they looked back at Indian history, Aurangzeb jumped out as one of the easiest to demonize, right? He was Muslim. He destroyed some temples. We can mess with the historiography, and they do mess with it, right? They do. One thing they do is abridged translations of chronicles from Aurangzeb's period and from other periods of Indo-Muslim history. So they sort of highlight the violent parts. They mistranslate certain parts. So it's really the British who demonize Aurangzeb, and then they can say, "Look, we the British. Maybe you don't like us, but hey, we're better than this guy. Before us, you had Aurangzeb Alamgir. How did that turn out for you, right?" This was only one of many, many ways that the British tried to justify their rule. That was a multi-pronged process. That British view of Aurangzeb and that historiography, it has had many, many permutations and adjustments over time, but it essentially continues today, right? The core of it hasn't changed. And perhaps unsurprisingly, what once served India's British masters now serves India's Hindu nationalist ones, right? So, the BJP and its Hindu nationalist allies, they don't have much use for British colonialism now, although they once did. That's another story, okay? But they do have very much a view for the demonization of Aurangzeb because hating on Indian Muslims is core to the Hindutva or Hindu nationalist project today. And Aurangzeb, with the several hundred years now we have of mythology surrounding him, he's a great dog whistle, right? He's a great way to signal the acceptability of hating, demeaning, and using violence against modern day Indian Muslims. And that's something, it's not the full story, obviously, it's just one part of the story in this sort of ongoing oppression of Indian Muslims today. But it is something that we've seen again and again rear its head. So you hear more about him because he's politically useful.
Right. Also, that reminds me that the thing that you said, that the British said that we are better than the priors. That's what that's what the governments today say, or especially the government, from what I have heard, like the BJP. Anyway, they go wrong. I'd rather not comment on this, but That's what I've heard. We're better than the priors. We're better than the priors. But that's not an excuse to be bad enough or so bad, so
Mm.
awfully bad. But
No,
yeah, but I
Mr.
try to stay away from that. But another thing, yeah, last thing that I would say, that have you, people usually accuse you of justifying Aurangzeb, but as a historian, do you think you've been uh, critical enough or analytical enough and or maybe unbiased enough to be able to understand him and analyze him and tear him apart and really see what was going on with him?
Mm. That's a great question. And honestly, I think it's probably one that I can't answer, right? If I thought that I was being biased or that I wasn't being critical enough or that I was misunderstanding something, I would have written the book differently, right? And there are parts of the book that there's been more scholarship on just since I've published it. Aurangzeb's relationships with Shia communities is one area where I might write it a little different now. I do really try to signal in the book where I'm uncertain, where I'm just really, I really don't know. I have some ideas, right? I try to sort of indicate the degree of certainty that I have, right? Like I'm pretty solid on, political motivations for destroying temples. I'm much less solid on what caused the downfall of the Mughal Empire. In terms of being critical, so it depends on what you mean by that term. If you're asking if I've judged him harshly enough, the answer is that I didn't set out to do that, right? Because that's beside my project, right? It's just not going where I want to go. That's not why I'm interested in Aurangzeb Alamgir. And if that's why you're interested in Aurangzeb Alamgir, then like don't read my book, right? Like talk to someone else about him is my answer, right? Like we're on different wavelengths on this front. I would like to think that I do sort of bring a harsh eye. I write. I write fairly critically, for example, of his later years in the Deccan, right, and things like that. But I think that doesn't get as much attention because it doesn't have any political punch today, right? Aurangzeb lost his military edge in the last couple of decades of his life and just like wandered around from hill fort to hill fort with no particular gain, as far as I can see. Like that's a fairly harsh criticism, but it doesn't pan out into any political value for any side today. So yes, I am critical, but I'm critical as a historian, right? Not as a modern political figure. Let me also just say something very quickly about bias. Okay, everyone's biased. We all stand at a particular moment in history, and I am keenly aware of that. Historians are trained for years to identify and attempt to deal with bias, even while knowing that we can never fully overcome it, right? You can never fully overcome your own moment in history. But I think that historians do a better job at that than most people because we try to be aware of it, right? And in that sense, I was highly aware of particularly the historiographical tradition of writing about Aurangzeb Alamgir, both in Persian text and in Western, particularly English texts, right? And that's something that, by sort of addressing, the biases of both of those sets of materials, I did try to overcome and present to the extent possible an equal-handed viewpoint.
And you've done a wonderful job. You've done a wonderful job. That's my opinion.
Thank you.
So that's the end of my questions. If other people have questions, please put them forward. I like people to ask their own questions. Yeah, this was something that came up. Can you speak on Aurangzeb's role regarding Sunni Shia tensions and what relationship did he have with Safavids?
So, okay, I would encourage people to distinguish between sort of Sunni Shia stuff and Safavid stuff, right? There's a lot of slippage there between meta religious categories and political empires. The Mughals had relations with the Safavids before and after Aurangzeb's time. They occasionally had skirmishes with them, but they also had diplomatic relations, and boys would go back and forth, that sort of thing. I don't think there were any traces essentially of the whole like Humayun possibly submitting to Safavid authority. That was sort of in the ancient past, so far as Aurangzeb and people in his time were concerned. In terms of Sunni Shia stuff, so there is historical debate about to what extent it's useful to use those sorts of large categories and understanding specific moments in Indian history. That said, there is a story about this. I believe I tell this story in my book, right? So in the 1680s, so a couple decades into Aurangzeb's reign, some Sunni guy shows up at court. Okay, keep in mind that like people are always showing up in Mughal India because Mughal India was wealthy, it was rich, there was employment, and it had relative freedom compared to like Safavid Persia or something. Okay, so people were always coming there. So this guy shows up, some Sunni guy shows up, and he looks around Aurangzeb's court and he's like, whoa, there's a lot of Shias here. So he goes to Aurangzeb and he says, yo, you have a lot of Shias working for you. Like, you're a Sunni, I'm a Sunni. Like, what, can you like get rid of these Shias? Like, I would be happier if you fired all these Shias. And Aurangzeb was like, no. Like, he said, absolutely not. Like, it doesn't matter what religion you are as long as you serve the Mughal king. And this story, it showcases the extent to which religion didn't matter when it came to who served the Mughal Empire, right? There were cases when Aurangzeb cared what your religion was, but by and large, what he cared about most was whether you were faithfully serving him and his purposes, right? He was a king before anything else.
Very well put. Yeah. So I think there's a question about whether you will be coming to Hyderabad. You were allowed to do a session earlier. Will you be coming to India soon, anytime soon?
Let's see on that. I mean, we don't know where we are in the pandemic, number one. I mean, currently I can't leave the United States, right? I mean, the United States has been largely quarantined by the rest of the world, and wisely so, given our completely inadequate response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Whether I'll be coming to India, I don't know. I mean, folks, you all know as much as I do, if not more, where India is politically and where it might be headed, right? I would love to come to India. I would not love to risk my life to do it.
Always welcome. And that was a thoroughly engaging session. It was great talking to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.